In this video, we're going to take a look at the path tracing kernel in Octane for Cinema 4D. And for this video, I'm using the cantina.c4d scene. So of course, you can get to the kernel settings by clicking on this button right here, or going into Octane Settings, and this will bring up the settings panel. In the kernel tab, you can choose your kernel. So a lot of the settings between the path tracing and direct lighting, which we discussed in the previous video, are kind of the same. So we're really just going to talk about those settings that are different or that have a significant impact on how this kernel works. So the path tracing kernel is probably the best choice for getting a nice looking realistic render in the least amount of render time. So it takes more time than direct lighting, but it's more physically accurate and thus tends to look better. But it's also faster than PMC, PMC being the most physically accurate of all the kernels. So it's a good middle ground choice for most rendering needs. Of course, our first setting is the max sample setting, which we've discussed before. This just tells Octane how long to calculate the scene before it should stop, or how many samples it should calculate before it stops. And then we have diffuse depth and specular depth, much like we had in the direct lighting kernel. One thing I wanted to point out about the live viewer is I am rendering with path tracing. You see up here, channel, it's set to DL for direct lighting. So it just sets that to default, but we're definitely working with path tracing. But to eliminate confusion, I'll set this to PT for path tracing. So it's a bit more obvious. The diffuse depth and the specular depth determine how many bounces each ray has off of those types of reflective surfaces before it's extinguished. So diffuse surface being like, these parts right here of the wall that are not terribly shiny or smooth, but maybe more of a rougher stone type quality. And of course, specular being transparent refractive surfaces here. So the setting of 16 is based on sort of a more real-world approximation. So it's very rare that you would need to have something higher than 16, but you can save some render time if you lower these if the scene doesn't require it. If I bring specular depth all the way down to 0, you'll see our glass bits here become completely opaque because the rays are not going through them. We don't have a glossy depth setting like we do for the direct lighting kernel. So the reflective surfaces are still reflective, but the transparent surfaces, light is not going through them. So as I start to raise them, you'll start to see some transparency coming through. Also some artifacts, depends on how thick the surface is. The more I bring this up, the more transparent they become. So diffuse depth, if I bring this all the way down to 0, you can see there's no light bouncing around in the shadows here. Because once a ray hits a diffuse surface, it kind of just ends right there. So if we raise this, we start to see more light bounce around in the shadows. The ray epsilon setting we've discussed before, so I'm going to bring this up a little bit, as well as the filter size. Let's take a look at another scene here to demonstrate Caustic Blur and GI clamp. So I'm in the robot and pilot scene, robot and pilot 01.c4d. And I'm rendering this with path tracing. So if we take a look at the Caustic Blur, we have basically light is coming through this giant magnifying glass here and then being focused onto this cube. So we see this caustic light pattern. You can see it's quite noisy. If I bring up the Caustic Blur, then it's going to blur that out, which will reduce the noise, but also make the shape, that caustic light pattern, a little bit, blurrier and less defined. So you can kind of balance this setting to achieve kind of the caustic light patterns that you want while reducing noise. The GI clamp reduces the amount of overall energy in the scene for global illumination. So if I bring this all the way down, we have no global illumination really at all. Of course, it renders a lot faster. As I start to bring this up, you'll start to see that we can also use this to reduce the amount of noise that we might see in this area here. But it will also make the caustic light pattern a little bit less bright. So I'm going to bring down Caustic Blur, and I'm also going to bring down GI Clamp. So you can see this is a little bit dimmer, but not quite as noisy. As I start to bring it up, we'll see that this is brighter, but a bit more noisy. So if you're struggling to get a good looking caustic light pattern in your scene, then at that point you should switch over to PMC And we've discussed that in the next movie. But that's really where you're going to get a more realistic or physically based lighting algorithm for calculating effects such as the caustic light pattern here. I want to do a quick comparison between sort of direct lighting and path tracing here with regards to things like refractions. So let's take a look through the magnifying glass here so you can see. I'm going to switch over to direct lighting. So you can see we are still having some decent refractions. It's a little bit darker, so let's increase the specular depth and let's set this to GI diffuse. Increase the glossy depth. It may not make a difference in what I'm trying to demonstrate. But you can see the refractions work nicely here. But if I zoom in to, say, the pilot's face within this transparent shield, you can see we're not getting a whole lot of light there. It's not looking great. If I switch to ambient occlusion, it's even worse. But if I switch over to path tracing, you can see more light. Now there's a little bit of roughness on the shield that's making it look a little bit foggy. We can, of course, fix this by then bring it all the way down to 0. You can see, okay, so that clears it up a little bit. So, again, if we take a look at direct lighting, we can see it is transparent, it is refractive, but not very much light is getting through and it doesn't look terribly realistic, even if I increase the specular depth. But if I switch over to path tracing, we get a much nicer looking result. So that's the basics of working with the path tracing kernel. In the next video, we'll take a look at working with PMC.